Should we allow more refugees into the UK than we can cope with, given the housing crisis and the strains on our public services?
Suzanne Evans.
The short answer is no. I would be the first to say that, of course, we've got to help refugees, not least given our track record, unfortunately, in causing, or at least contributing to instability in some of the countries that these refugees are coming from. But we need to make a distinction between refugees and migrants. And unfortunately, in a lot of the coverage that we've had about this crisis, that distinction hasn't been made adequately enough. We know that only 1 in 5 are actually coming from Syria. We know that many others are clearly economic migrants who are coming from countries where they are not unsafe, and that they have arrived in countries where they are safe, yet they seem to want to keep going on and on to Germany, perhaps to come to Britain, or to go to a country of choice. Now, I fully support, actually, David Cameron's bid to take 20,000 refugees. I think that's fair, and I think he's absolutely right to take them from the camps, which are run by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, so we know these people are being processed properly. And, of course, some of the first people have already arrived this week. But from a point of view of our national security, I think we have to be very careful. We know that Islamic State is infiltrating some of the people who are coming across on the boats. And we also have to, I think, to be fair to the people who are on our housing waiting lists, which are getting longer and longer. And your question, you put it very well. Should we take more than we can cope with? Absolutely not.
So your view is 20,000, that's it?
Well, I think 20,000, it's going to be over a 5-year period. My worry is that the way that the European Union is playing this, and at the moment we have an opt-out from taking the 120,000 that the other EU member states in Schengen have been asked to take this week. My worry is that we might not be able to opt out for that for very long. And already we can hear the EU dictatorial bureaucrats talking, well, David Cameron, if you want to renegotiate the terms of our EU membership, you must take more refugees. We're being blackmailed by the EU once again.
Yanis Varoufakis.
Well, let me begin by saying that the answer to the question is exactly the opposite. Firstly, let me remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that we're all migrants. And we're all economic migrants. I believe that, if I believe my anthropologist friends, we are all Africans, actually, who came to these parts of the world.
It was a long time ago.
A long time ago, but the notion that at the time, when there are tens of thousands of desperate refugees being washed up in the shores of Greece and Italy, when there are 3.1 million refugees from that particular conflict in Jordan, in Turkey, in Lebanon, and that these poor countries have opened their doors to these refugees and they welcome them, they've sheltered them, they feed them, they make sure that they have water to drink. To have this discussion in Cambridge today on whether there will be 10 or 20,000 people who are let in, to have this moral panic because there are a few wretched souls on the other side of the channel in Calais, this is not putting in good stead this country. This country deserves a lot better.
Is your view that... As you said, we're talking about millions of people. Is your view that there should be a completely open door policy, that they should be able to go to any country?
That's the logical answer.
I have a tendency to say that I think that borders are an absurdity looked at from space.
Yanis.
But
yeah?
We should have a robust debate on precisely the mechanics of dealing with this humanitarian crisis.
All right, well, it begins
to simply conjure up ridiculously, pathetically low numbers, for a start, we are running the risk of turning Mrs. Merkel into the moral maiden.
All right. Ken Clarke.
Well, the answer to the question is I think we should we're going to have to take as many as we can cope with. You obviously can't take the world's poor, but there's a mass migration going on around the world. Same thing's happening in the Americas, same thing's happening in Asia, and we've been taken by surprise by it. But we should also take it quite apart from the EU question. People are coming from desperate countries into Europe. They're heading for Germany and Sweden. After that, Britain's quite quite a popular destination. And the idea they come because we're in the EU, and somehow they wouldn't want to come if we weren't in the EU, and it's all something to do with the EU that this has all happened, is frankly a total irrelevance.
Angela Merkel said...
Well, if it's an irrelevance, let's leave it. If it's an irrelevance, leave it. Is 20,000 the right figure, which is the figure over the next 5 years?
20,000 is a good start, and they're being let in an ordered fashion. They're being identified as vulnerable people, and they're being taken from dreadful camps in Jordan and Lebanon. And what the whole of Europe, we could need a Europe-wide agreement. Firstly, how we get under control and on top of this and cope with it sensibly, and then how we sort out the genuine refugees from people who've joined the flood from other countries like Albania or Pakistan because they think that suddenly they have the prospect of a job here, then how we deal in a civilised fashion, in a more orderly fashion, with the ones coming in.
But you haven't answered the question which Jacqueline asked, which was, should we allow more in? She says because
we may have to, because I think this is going to be a problem for the next 10 or 20 years.
All right.
I think we're only seeing it beginning. It's going to be very difficult to stop. You've got to stop it being a race across Europe for the most courageous and the fittest to see how far they could get. You've got to have some place where you can accommodate them in civilised circumstances whilst you actually process them, and then decide how you're going to house some, where you're going to put them, and how you're going to get the ones
We'll talk about whether it's possible to do that. The woman up there at the back, please.
In a wider sense, can we ask why it's a European question at all? What is the rest, I mean, aside from Turkey taking in 2 million refugees, what is the rest of the world doing? Aside from the desperate situation today during the Hajj, Saudi Arabia has 2 million tents that are already plumbed, they're air-conditioned. Why aren't some of these leaders of these major Islamic countries going, why don't we help out?
Chris Bryant.
I think you make an absolutely vital point. And some of the richest countries in the world are doing absolutely nothing, and they should be getting off their backsides and helping, because, I mean, I get quite upset when I hear people talk about people as if they're trying to break all the rules and they're just doing it because they feel like it. Who on earth in their right mind would leave their home with their 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old children and cross dangerous seas, cross miles and miles across a continent, if they weren't, the only people who would do that were people who absolutely had to because they had no alternative to save their children's lives and their own. So I think, I'm sorry, Jacqueline, I disagree with the premise of your question, because you said, should we take more than we can cope with? Of course we shouldn't take more than we can cope with, but I think we can cope with more than we are taking at the moment. And I think this country's heart is big enough to cope with more.
So Chris,
in the First World War, we took many thousands more than we're considering now from Belgium. And they all went back after the First World War when their country was made safe. And that was when many millions of people had died on the fields of Flanders.
So what do you say,
Hold on a second. I'll come to you, Jacqueline, and I'll come back to you.
Okay.
Yes,
But
Jacqueline.
yes, you know, we've got to help these poor people, but they're risking their lives to go over the water, and, you know, they're landing in a safe country. But why do they still want to get to, you know, other...
Well, they want
England...
They want to live.
I think they want to come to a country like this country because they'll be safe,
soft.
because we have the rule of law, because everyone is treated equally under the law,
Does Greece not have the rule of law?
And frankly, because we're one of the richest countries in the world, and we should be ashamed of ourselves when we don't open our arms.
Julia Hartley-Brewer. Julia.
Julia, very briefly, because you asked me something about whether Greece has the rule of law. Let me tell you that after the Iron Curtain collapsed, a country of 10 million people took in 1.5 million people. Yep. So we have a sterling record of opening our doors.
Julia.
Jacqueline asked, should we allow more refugees to come than we can cope with? The answer is clearly no, but the question is how many can we cope with? And that is the big issue. Probably more than 20,000 over 5 years. Realistically, yes. We could probably, if we needed to, we could probably take another 20,000, another 100,000, maybe 1 million, maybe 2 million, maybe 10 million. There are 10 million displaced Syrians within Syria, 4 million who've left the country. Why don't we take them all? We can afford it. We're a wealthy country. But we're not going to, and neither is the rest of Europe going to. There are roughly 5 billion people on the planet who are not as wealthy as your average European. Shall we take them as well? The reality is, Europe, I'm sorry to say, as much as I want us to be a safe haven for people in desperate need seeking asylum, as we were for Jews fleeing Nazism and other people over the years, we cannot be the answer, the solution to this problem, because this problem is bigger than that. We cannot have every single person who wants to live in a better country, have more chances of jobs and a nicer home, coming to our country. We don't know. I didn't interrupt you. The key issue here is, there was a quote from the European Council President, Donald Tusk, who said, "The greatest tide of refugees and migrants is yet to come." We've got to get to grips with the fact we are not talking about tens of thousands, we are talking about tens of millions. And the reason they are getting on boats and trying to come to Europe is because Germany and other countries said, "Come on in, you're welcome."
Oh, so that's the problem.
They were sitting in, they were living in Jordan and Turkey for 3 years.
Suddenly doing the right thing is the cause of the problem.
Germany has a demographic time bomb.
Yanis,
We don't.
do you make a distinction, which many people are making, between people who are fleeing in terror for their lives and people who are searching for a better economic system to live under, where they can prosper better than they could?
Of course I make the distinction, but at the same time I recognise that the distinction is rather blurred in many occasions, because starving to death due to lack of economic opportunity...
They're not starving to death.
Well, some people are.
They're not people
some
in Syria.
people
People
are
in
coming to
Ghana.
Julia, listen, panel, you've got to let each person have a say, one at a time. Otherwise, our audience here
with
and our
migrants
audience
from
at home
Africa
can't hear what's being
who
said.
migrated to Greece under incredible circumstances because their kids were starving to death. I cannot easily say that these people are undeserving, whereas others are deserving because they were shot at. You may make this distinction, but I'm not going to follow you.
A member of the audience, you up there, sir, in the third row.
I agree with most of what Mr. Varoufakis is saying, but surely it'd be more effective to use our resources to solve the conflict in Syria rather than taking in refugees, because the refugee crisis is only a consequence of the conflict, and only by solving the conflict can we solve the whole problem altogether.
How would you solve the conflict in Syria?
I think
That's a whole
I think democratically it's probably the best way forward. However, over the past few years, not a lot has been done over the Syrian conflict, and it's only now that ISIS have come up that countries like America and the UK are actually starting to get involved, because they see that ISIS is actually a threat to them, whereas before it didn't involve them whatsoever.
The woman up there at the right.
Well, the UK is probably one of the most densely populated countries in the whole of the EU. It's probably twice as densely populated as the Eastern European countries that have refused to take any immigrants into the country, and it's certainly much more heavily populated than France. I think probably not quite twice, but surely it should be done on the basis of resources. I mean, our NHS is suffering. Everything. We've got people starving in this country. We have people using food banks. Surely, we can be looking at countries that are sparsely populated and take that into account.
All right. And you, sir, the spectacles? No, you don't want to speak. I'll come to you in the second row here, and I'll go back to the panel. Yes, you.
I'd just like to counter the lady's point. She said that Eastern European countries are really sparsely populated, which is true, but they're countries that aren't willing to accept the migrants. Why would we force such desperate people to go to places where they're going to be victimised, they're going to be put in places they don't want to be in, where people don't want them? Why don't we take them somewhere here where we saw the march, people want to help? Where in Eastern European countries, very non-secular countries, very Christian countries, don't want such a Muslim demographic. Why don't we allow them into a country opening its arms?
Suzanne Evans, what's your reply to him?
Well, actually, I think you might think that, but every poll that's been done of the general public actually suggests that we think we're doing enough already. Yeah. Last year, 558,000 migrants came to this country. It's not as though we're not unwelcoming, and it's not as though we're not taking enough already. And what I'd like to say to Chris and Yanis, really, is we've got 9,000 people sleeping rough on our streets in this country. As the lady up there said, we've got over 500,000 people using food banks. banks. You know, NHS waiting lists are at their absolute peak, highest ever. We're having to make welfare cuts, apparently, because we're in such dire straits in terms of our economy. And I'd like to say, you know what austerity is like, Yanis. You know what austerity is like. Would you really see Britain brought back to that level? Would you? Would you? Do you think that Greece, and the problems that Greece is having now, with thousands, tens of thousands of refugees turning up on its doorstep every day, that's not helping the situation in Greece, is it? You must know that.
All right, Suzanne, you made the point.
You're
Yanis,
assuming that migrants are coming in to steal jobs.
No, I'm not.
Migrants
I'm not.
boost
Absolutely
economic growth
not.
in the long
That's
run.
not what I...
The United States of America would not have been a major force today if they built borders in the 19th century, preventing economic migrants from walking in.
Borders in the 19th century.
All right,
And if you see a migrant in the NHS, it's likely to be somebody who's treating you, not being treated.
All right. No, I'm going to go on. I'll take one more point from the woman over there, but I want to then move on, because we've had a quarter of the programme, and we've got many more questions.
It's a huge problem.
Well, we won't solve it in one edition of Question Time, I can tell you.
So, Ms Evans said that 500,000 people are coming into the country. How many people are leaving the country, isn't it?
Well, net migration...
And sorry, one more thing. I work for the
330,000
NHS, and I know for a fact that migrants have nothing to do with the waiting lists.
Exactly. Okay, right, I'm going to stop you. All right. We're going to move... All right, Suzanne, you've had your say. You've had your say. We're going to move on.
I really think we've generated more heat than light on... It's an enormous subject, multifaceted. As somebody said, it starts with how do you tackle the problems of Syria, Iraq, Eritrea, Somalia. Now, that'll take us all evening. Where do you put people when they come out? How do you process them? How do you calculate who can cope? That's a big thing. What we mustn't reduce it to is everybody getting panicked and angry and saying, why don't they go to other countries? We took 30,000 East African Asians into this country, and like the other migrants we've received, they actually make a very positive contribution to our economy. But it requires rational discussion, organisation, international agreement, which will take time, and then we will still find it's an enormous problem. But you combine humanitarian instincts, which are uppermost in this country, with the practicalities. And at the moment, we're beginning to do that, and we've got to work with the other 27 members of the European Union in the first place to decide how actually we're going to cope and stop arguing with each other about exactly how we might shove some more back to Greece.